It's spring, 1944. A Luftwaffe general is flying a Focke-Wulf 190 over Magdeburg in central Germany. He spots a formation of American B-17s. He moves to attack. Then 4 P-51 Mustangs drop on him. Not over France, not over the Channel. Over central Germany. He doesn't try to fight, he dives. The Mustangs stay on him. In desperation, he fires his guns forward so the smoke trails backward, making the Americans think he has rear-firing weapons. They break off. He escapes. He knows what this means. If American fighters can escort bombers this deep into the Reich, the Luftwaffe is finished. That pilot was Adolf Galland, Germany's General of Fighters, one of the most decorated combat aviators in the Luftwaffe. And he had gone up on an unauthorized sortie because he needed to see the situation for himself. Galland didn't need to shoot one down to prove his point. Other Luftwaffe units had been downing P-51s across Germany for weeks. Galland gathered the wreckage from those crash sites and presented the evidence to Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal of the Greater German Reich, commander of the most powerful air force in Europe. Göring's response? He called the report the ravings of a worn-out defeatist. He issued an order. No American fighters have crossed into Germany. It is forbidden to claim otherwise. His explanation for the crashed Mustangs? The short-range fighters must have run out of fuel at high altitude and glided into German territory after being shot down further west. Galland later wrote that this was absurd. If an Allied pilot was going to glide anywhere after being hit, he would glide west toward friendly territory, not deeper into Germany. But Göring didn't care about logic. He cared about maintaining the lie that his Luftwaffe was still in control. This moment captures everything wrong with Germany's air war. The best pilots in the world, flying against impossible odds, led by a man who literally ordered them to deny reality. And the story of how that relationship collapsed, how Germany's greatest aces eventually staged a mutiny against their own commander, reveals something more damaging than any Allied bombing raid. The Luftwaffe wasn't destroyed by the Americans or the British. It was destroyed from the inside. If you enjoy deep dives into how leadership failures shaped the war, hit subscribe. To understand why Germany's fighter pilots came to despise Göring, you have to understand how he got the job in the first place. Because it had nothing to do with competence. Hermann Göring was a legitimate World War I hero. He'd been the last commander of the legendary Richthofen Squadron, Manfred von Richthofen's personal fighter unit. He had 22 aerial victories. He'd earned the Pour le Mérite, Imperial Germany's highest military honor. But that was 1918. By the time Göring took command of the Luftwaffe in 1935, aviation had changed beyond recognition. Monoplanes had replaced biplanes. Engines had tripled in horsepower. Radar was emerging. Strategic bombing theory was transforming how air forces thought about war. Göring understood none of it. He got the Luftwaffe because he was Hitler's most loyal political ally, not because he understood modern air power, and he treated it accordingly. The Luftwaffe wasn't just an air force to Göring. It was a personal empire. He also controlled the 4-year plan, making him effectively Germany's economic czar. He looted occupied Europe on an industrial scale, amassing one of the largest private art collections in history. He built Karin Hall, a palatial hunting lodge north of Berlin, while his pilots were sleeping in frozen airfield tents on the Eastern Front. But Göring's ego created a far more dangerous problem than mere corruption. He staffed the Luftwaffe's most critical positions with personal friends instead of qualified professionals. And nowhere was this more catastrophic than his choice for head of aircraft procurement. Ernst Udet was the second highest-scoring German ace of World War I with 62 victories, a genuine legend. After the war, he'd become a stunt pilot, a barnstormer, a movie actor, a playboy. He was charming, entertaining, and completely unqualified to manage the industrial procurement of a modern air force. Göring gave him the job anyway. By 1939, Udet was overseeing 26 departments responsible for all aircraft production, armament, and supply for the entire Luftwaffe. He hated paperwork. He had no industrial management experience, and he made a decision that would cripple Germany's air war before it even began. Udet was obsessed with dive bombing. He'd seen the American Curtiss Hawk perform dive attacks during a visit to the United States and became convinced that every German bomber needed dive bombing capability. Not just the Stuka. Everything. This obsession produced one of the most absurd engineering disasters of the war. The Heinkel 177 was supposed to be Germany's heavy strategic bomber, the aircraft that could hit Soviet factories beyond the Urals, that could close the gap with Britain's Lancaster and America's B-17. Instead, Udet insisted the He-177 be capable of dive bombing, a four-engine heavy bomber, dive bombing. The engineering compromises required to make this work were insane. Heinkel was forced to pair the four engines into two nacelles, each driving a single propeller through a complex gearbox. The engines overheated constantly. They caught fire in flight. Crews called the He-177 the Luftwaffe's lighter because it had a tendency to spontaneously combust. The result was that Germany never fielded an effective strategic bomber during the entire war. The He-177 did enter limited service in 1943, but its chronic unreliability made it operationally useless in meaningful numbers. While Britain and America built thousands of Lancasters, Halifaxes, B-17s and B-24s, Germany's heavy bomber program was crippled by the compounding failures of dive bombing requirements, coupled engine overheating, and chronic materials shortages. By 1941, Udet knew it. He'd led a delegation inspecting the Soviet aviation industry earlier that year and reported to Göring that Soviet air capabilities were far stronger than anyone expected. Göring buried the report. He didn't tell Hitler. He hoped a surprise attack would destroy the Soviet Air Force on the ground and the problem would disappear. On November 17, 1941, Ernst Udet's life came to an end in his Berlin apartment. He left a note in red pencil. According to his biography, The Fall of an Eagle, it read, "Iron One, you are responsible." Iron One was his nickname for Göring. Udet had been struggling for years. His rivalry with State Secretary Erhard Milch, his personal demons, and reportedly his horror at what he'd learned about the Eastern Front had all taken their toll. But the note named Göring. The Nazi regime covered up what happened. They announced Udet had been lost while testing a new weapon and gave him a state funeral. And in a final cruel twist, Werner Mölders, then Germany's highest-scoring fighter ace with 115 victories and the first recipient of the Diamonds to the Knight's Cross, was killed when his Heinkel 111 transport went down in bad weather at Breslau while en route to Udet's funeral. Two of Germany's greatest aviators gone within days of each other. One destroyed by the system Göring built, the other lost to chance while mourning the first. The Luftwaffe's institutional rot was already consuming its best people. And the real disaster hadn't even started yet. By 1943, the Luftwaffe's best pilots were flying missions they knew were hopeless. Not because of Allied superiority, because their own air force had been designed for a war that ended in 1940. The German Air Force was built as a tactical weapon, close air support, battlefield interdiction, Stuka dive bombers screaming down on enemy columns, medium bombers hitting airfields and supply depots within a few hundred miles of the front. For Poland, it was devastating. For France, it was perfect. Short campaigns, short distances, total air superiority over a narrow front. But after 1940, Germany was no longer fighting short wars over short distances. It was fighting a grinding multi-front conflict against three industrial superpowers simultaneously. and a tactical air force cannot win that kind of war. The strategic bomber program had been gutted by Udet's dive-bombing obsession. But the problem ran deeper than one man's fixation. In June 1936, General Walter Wever, the Luftwaffe's first chief of staff and its strongest advocate for strategic air power, was killed in a Heinkel He-70 crash. Wever had championed a long-range heavy bomber program, the so-called Ural bomber, designed to strike deep into Soviet territory. His death removed the program's most powerful protector. Over the following years, the strategic bomber concept was gradually strangled by a combination of Nazi short war doctrine, resource constraints, and the rise of medium bomber advocates like Udet. No one with enough authority or conviction remained to fight for it. That meant Germany entered the war without the ability to conduct strategic bombing. The Luftwaffe couldn't hit Soviet factories in the Urals. It couldn't close the Atlantic shipping lanes. It couldn't sustain a bombing campaign against British industry. When the war demanded reach, the Luftwaffe had none. This wasn't a wartime failure. It was a pre-war design flaw, baked into the Luftwaffe's DNA before the first bomb ever dropped on Poland. And the Luftwaffe reflected Göring's personality. Flashy, impressive on the surface, designed for quick victories and dramatic headlines, completely hollow when tested against sustained pressure. His pilots could see this. From the cockpit, the structural problems were obvious. They were flying the right planes for 1939 and the wrong planes for 1943. And when they tried to tell Göring, he didn't want to hear it. But the structural problems were only half the story. Because Göring wasn't just incompetent at planning, he was actively destructive in command. And he developed a pattern that would make every fighter pilot in the Luftwaffe despise him personally. Once you see it, you'll understand why his own men eventually tried to remove him. Göring would make a grandiose promise. The promise would fail. His pilots would pay the price. And then Göring would blame the pilots. The first time was the Battle of Britain, 1940. Göring personally promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would destroy the Royal Air Force and establish air superiority over the English Channel, clearing the path for a potential invasion. For the first few weeks, it was actually working. Luftwaffe attacks on RAF airfields and sector stations were causing serious damage. Fighter command was under real strain. British pilot losses were barely being replaced. Then, Göring intervened. In early September, he ordered the switch from attacking airfields to bombing London. The strategic shift gave fighter command exactly what it needed: breathing room to repair airfields, rest pilots, and rebuild squadrons. But the tactical damage went deeper than the target switch. Göring ordered his Bf 109 fighters into close escort formations, flying directly alongside the bombers at bomber speed and bomber altitude. This neutralized everything that made the 109 dangerous. It was a fast, high-altitude interceptor being forced to fly low and slow, stripped of the speed and maneuverability that gave it an edge over the Spitfire. Pilots who broke escort to engage RAF fighters were disciplined. According to his memoirs, Galland was at Carinhall when Göring demanded to know what his fighters needed to win. Galland claimed he responded that he'd like an outfit of Spitfires, half joke, half genuine fury. The Bf 109 wasn't inferior to the Spitfire in a free fight, but chained to a bomber formation at 15,000 feet, it was a sitting target. Göring's own tactical directives were getting his men killed. The RAF survived. The Luftwaffe's losses became unsustainable. And when the campaign failed, Göring blamed his fighter pilots. He accused them of cowardice, of lacking aggressive spirit. Not his strategy, not his decisions, his pilots. Then came the promise that sealed Göring's reputation forever. Stalingrad. Winter 1942. The Sixth Army was encircled, roughly 265,000 Axis soldiers trapped. Göring personally guaranteed Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the pocket by air. The Sixth Army needed somewhere between 500 and 750 tons per day to maintain combat effectiveness. The Luftwaffe delivered an average of roughly 117 tons per day. Transport pilots flew into anti-aircraft fire, blizzards, and Soviet fighters in slow Junkers 52 transports that were never designed for this kind of mission. Many of those pilots were pulled from flight training schools. They were the Luftwaffe's instructors. Their deaths created a cascading failure that wouldn't be fully understood for another year. Not only did the airlift fail catastrophically, but it hollowed out the training infrastructure that was supposed to produce the next generation of combat pilots. Approximately 488 aircraft were lost during the Stalingrad airlift, including 266 Ju-52 transports. Göring's promise contributed to the fate of 250,000 trapped soldiers, of whom barely 6,000 would survive Soviet captivity, and simultaneously devastated the Luftwaffe's ability to train replacements. And who did Göring blame? Not himself. Never himself. The pilots who hadn't flown aggressively enough, the ground crews who hadn't maintained aircraft properly, everyone except the man who made the promise that everyone in the Luftwaffe knew was impossible from the start. This pattern repeated across 1943 and 44. According to Galland's memoirs, Göring would alternate between threats of execution and tearful self-pity, sometimes within the same conversation. His accusations became so routine that Luftwaffe officers joked darkly about them. By 1944, the contempt was mutual. Göring retreated to Karinhal to admire his stolen art and inject morphine while his pilots fought and died in skies they no longer controlled. He was a ghost commander, still technically in charge but operationally irrelevant. But here's what turned contempt into fury. Because what Göring did to the training pipeline didn't just hurt the Luftwaffe, it sent an entire generation of young pilots to their graves. In early 1944, a new Luftwaffe fighter pilot arrived at his operational unit with roughly 160 hours of total flight training. A few months later, that number dropped to 112 hours. By spring, the B flight schools were disbanded entirely. New pilots went directly from basic training to frontline combat. Across the Channel, an American fighter pilot had approximately 225 to 300 hours before ever seeing an enemy. Trained with unlimited fuel in safe skies, with experienced instructors who stayed in the training pipeline. German pilots had none of that. Fuel allocations for training collapsed from 50,000 tons in April 1944 to just 7,000 tons by October. The experienced instructors had been pulled from schools and sent to the front, or lost in the Stalingrad airlift. By late 1944, some German fighter pilots arrived at their squadrons with as little as 10 to 20 hours on the actual aircraft they were expected to fly in combat. In extreme cases, that number dropped to 3 to 5 hours. On a Bf-109 or FW-190, against American pilots with hundreds, the result was slaughter. In some hard-pressed units like JG-300, the average life expectancy of a new pilot dropped to roughly 11 hours of flight time. Barely 4 sorties, including ferry flights. Think about what that means. A young German pilot, maybe 19 or 20, finishes his truncated training. He's posted to a fighter squadron defending German cities against 1,000-bomber raids. He climbs into his Bf-109 for his first real combat mission. Statistically, he won't survive his fourth, and the veterans knew it. They watched it happen every week. New faces in the briefing room, empty chairs by the end of the month, the same cycle over and over. What made it unforgivable was that it didn't have to be this way. Galland had been arguing for years that the Luftwaffe needed to prioritize defensive fighter operations and preserve its experienced pilots. He wanted the Experten, the aces who had survived hundreds of sorties, pulled back to serve as instructors and squadron leaders who could keep the new pilots alive long enough to learn. He wanted to build a sustainable training pipeline that could produce competent pilots even as losses mounted. Göring refused. He hoarded elite pilots in prestige units. He demanded offensive operations that burned through irreplaceable veteran aviators. And when Galland finally built a strategic fighter reserve of over 2,000 aircraft, Göring threw it away in a single morning. Operation Bodenplatte, January 1st, 1945. A massive surprise attack on Allied airfields in the Low Countries designed to support the failing Ardennes offensive. Over 900 German aircraft launched at dawn. The operation destroyed approximately 305 Allied aircraft on the ground and shot down another 70 in air combat. Impressive for about 48 hours. Allied losses were made good within days. American and British production could replace 375 aircraft without breaking stride. German losses were catastrophic and irreplaceable. Approximately 271 aircraft destroyed, some hit by their own anti-aircraft batteries due to inadequate coordination between flak units and the attacking force. Worse still, 213 pilots were killed, missing, or captured, including dozens of experienced formation leaders and unit commanders who could never be replaced. Galland's carefully built fighter reserve, the one strategic asset that might have slowed the Allied bombing campaign, was burned through in a single morning for a tactical advantage that evaporated before sunset. The men who survived were furious, and they were about to do something unprecedented in the history of the German military. January 19th, 1945. The Haus der Flieger in Berlin. The House of the Aviator. A group of the most decorated fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe gathered for a confrontation with Hermann Göring. Among them were some of the most accomplished combat aviators in history. Günther Lützow, 110 victories. Johannes Steinhoff, 176 victories. Hannes Trautloft, 58 victories. Gerhard Michalski, 73 victories. Men who had been fighting since Spain, since Poland, since the Battle of Britain. Men who had watched their squadrons bled white while their commander collected stolen paintings. Galland himself wasn't present. He'd been relieved of his command as General of Fighters on January 13th and placed under virtual house arrest. But his peers knew what he'd been saying for years, and they'd come to say it to Göring's face. Lützow served as spokesman. He presented a memorandum that laid out what every frontline pilot already knew. The Luftwaffe's fighter force was being destroyed by its own leadership. Göring's insistence on offensive operations was suicidal. The diversion of Me-262 jets to bomber roles instead of fighter intercept was criminal waste. Pilot training had collapsed. Fuel allocation was irrational, and the constant accusations of cowardice against pilots who were dying at unprecedented rates were destroying what remained of morale. Lützow didn't soften it. He told Göring directly that the Luftwaffe High Command was fundamentally incompetent and responsible for the collapse of effective fighter operations. In a functioning military, this would have been a reform proposal. In the Third Reich, it was mutiny. Göring's response was exactly what you'd expect from a man who had spent years denying reality. He threatened to have them shot. According to one account, he wanted Galland, Lützow and Steinhoff executed, but couldn't assemble a case because each man was a national hero whose death would cause a public scandal. So he broke them up instead. Lützow was banished to a desk job in Italy. Steinhoff was reassigned, Trautloft was fired and sent to run a flight school. Others were scattered to remote postings where many would die in the war's final weeks. Galland received what Göring probably intended as a death sentence disguised as a consolation prize, command of a small unit of Me-262 jets, Jagdverband 44. "Staff it with whoever you want," Göring told him. "Fly your jets. see if they make a difference. What happened next was darkly poetic. In late February 1945, after Hitler personally intervened, Galland was given permission to form Jagdverband 44, an elite unit equipped with Me-262 jet fighters. Operating out of Munich-Riem in the war's final weeks, JV-44 became the most elite fighter unit in the Luftwaffe almost by accident. The pilots Göring had tried to silence gravitated toward Galland's command. Men with Knight's Crosses and hundreds of victories between them, flying the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. It became known after the war as the Squadron of Experts. They fought brilliantly and pointlessly. Galland himself scored 7 victories in the Me-262, bringing his career total to 104. On April 26, his final mission, he claimed 2 B-26 Marauders before being wounded by P-47 Thunderbolts and crash-landing at Munich-Riem. Steinhoff was horribly burned in a takeoff accident. Lützow disappeared on a combat mission in April 1945 and was never found. The revolt changed nothing. Göring remained nominally in command until he tried to succeed Hitler in April and was stripped of all ranks. By then, it didn't matter. There was no Luftwaffe left to command, but the fighter pilots' revolt revealed something that matters far beyond 1945. These weren't dissidents or resistance fighters. They were professional soldiers who believed in their mission. They simply could not stay silent any longer. And they lost. Because in a dictatorship, being right doesn't matter if you aren't powerful. And Göring, for all his failures, still had Hitler's protection until the very end. Here's what makes the Luftwaffe story different from every other German military failure of World War II. The Wehrmacht was beaten by superior numbers and resources. The Kriegsmarine was beaten by Allied technology and intelligence. Those were external defeats. The enemy was simply stronger. The Luftwaffe was beaten from inside. Germany had the pilots. It had the aircraft designs. The Me-262 was years ahead of anything the Allies fielded. The FW-190 was one of the finest piston-engine fighters of the war. German pilots like Erich Hartmann, Gerhard Barkhorn, and Galland himself were among the most skilled combat aviators who ever lived. None of it mattered. Because the man running the Air Force staffed critical positions with drinking buddies, promised results he couldn't deliver, blamed his own men for failures he created, destroyed the pipeline that produced future pilots, and when his best officers finally told him the truth, tried to have them shot. That's the difference between winning and losing an air war. Not technology, not courage, not individual brilliance. Leadership. Göring took the most experienced air force in Europe and ran it into the ground in 5 years. His pilots knew it was happening. They told him. He tried to destroy them for telling him. So here's the question, and it doesn't have an obvious answer. Was Göring the most destructive military leader of any single branch during World War II? Or is there someone whose incompetence caused even more damage? Drop your answer in the comments. Like this video if this changed how you think about the Luftwaffe. Subscribe for more breakdowns of how leadership failures shaped the war. Thanks for watching.